topic that we've got to tackle is rather wide, because it refers to governance, it refers to management of sustainability, technology, and these are all very, very topical, burning issues of the time, particularly since the United Nations adopted the Sustainable Development Goals, and when these goals were adopted, it was done in a much more participative and consultative manner than the UN bureaucracy's Millennium Development Goals, which received somewhat half-hearted reception on the part of heads of government and states. But the SDGs have been taken seriously, and we have a strong commitment on the part of the member states of the United Nations for that, and also on the part of business. But then, when you think of it as sustainability as comprising aspects that have to do with finance and economics, has to do with society, social relations, and it has to do with environment and nature. And it's quite clear that there is a saying that not all good things always go together, and so there would be tensions, particularly when you are managing a corporation or even running a government, between these very different goals of the economic dimension, the social dimension, and the relationship with nature and environment may create tensions. And that means that we have to be very nimble in the governance, whether it is the governance of the state or the governance of a corporation, in holding up all of these balls in the air, juggling with them, and making sure that those tensions do not undermine the one or the other dimension of this issue. And there is a certain hope that technology would come to our aid, that it would enable us to do more with less, because of innovation and technology. That's a hope. But there's equally the other dimension of the side to technology, which raises concerns about privacy, about human dignity, about agency that human beings like to have. People like to think that they are not robots, that they are not determined people, that they have some self and free will. And then you have artificial intelligence that can be, continually manipulating in a subtle way the things that we choose to do and wish to buy, and the viewpoints that we may wish to take, or whom we may even elect in a democratic polity. So these are all tremendous concerns that have come up, just as technology can make a very big difference to drudgery and to renewal of capital. There is also this danger. So these are all issues, and we have this panel who is fantastically experienced, very thoughtful people. So I'd like each of you to reflect a little on these challenges and responses for the first round. Then we can come back to some more issues that require a little more in-depth investigation. So without taking up too much time, I'd like to invite Mr. Shahi to lead off for about 6 or 7 minutes with his reflections on the theme of our panel. Thank you, sir. Over to you.
As Sudarshan rightly said, that this subject today is so wide, and what we got in communication, I thought at that time that the subject is heavily weighted toward corporate governance. But now the topic is future, how do we manage the technology, what is the role of leadership, and of course sustainability is a big factor. So let me restructure what I thought earlier on the present situation of in the global context, and more importantly in Indian context. Because now when we talk of managing the future and managing the technology of the future, as it's a good topic to talk about. And then we have just seen COP26 getting completed with some degree of enthusiasm, some degree of optimism, some degree of criticism here and there. And of course, India has been in the forefront of these discussions. And the subject is so important that it covers everything. Sustainability, it covers the management of change, it covers the technology development. So I think it is better that we slightly reorient our discussion insofar as I am concerned. I think COP26 has a lot to say and to comment on what is likely to happen and what is happening in India on the energy scene. Energy and economy are so much closely interlinked that it cannot be without the heavy dependence on how we are producing energy, how we are using energy, and how sustainable it is for a long period of time. I would feel that never in the past, at least in the last 50, 60 years that we have been active, the management of change and the burden on the management of change has been as heavy as it is going to be now and already that we are experiencing today. And also the need and recognition, need has always been there, the recognition of development of technology to the point of disruptive technologies coming in a significant way in each area of economy, in each area of industry, and particularly in the field of energy. At least last 40 years plus, I have dealt with this issue of energy. But in these 40 years, always we have talked of energy and climate. But what we have talked last 2-3 years, that is substantially different, significantly different in terms of both quantity and quality of discussion, that as compared to what has been happening in the last, say, 40 and odd years. And India again has been in the focus. India and China, of course, we had a huge development role to play for providing access to energy to the huge population that did not have. Even today, all of them don't have. And therefore, we have been in the focus. COP26 suggests, and even before COP26, our massive shift from the age-old fossil fuel centric energy process, energy production process, energy usage process, in the last 5 years, you have seen is undergoing very drastic and radical changes. And this has all the nuances of managing changes. When we have drawn a plan of a very exponential type of growth of renewables in the country, we have started experiencing, as it was predicted, a whole range of issues that get connected normally, academically, as well as in practice, when you try to manage such a major change and at a very rapid speed. As of today, we have something like 390,000 megawatt of power capacity in the country, and we just have about 1,200 kilowatt hour per head per year of electricity consumption. It's not good. It's not very good. It is less than 1/3 of the global average. And so we can see we have to go a long way. We have to go a long way to provide education, to provide healthcare, to provide industrial development, to provide business development, and to provide all types of modern living to the people which they have been aspiring for. We are way behind, and therefore we have a whole range of things to do. And at the same time, so far as India is concerned, our resources are rather limited in terms of energy. We are a coal-centric, you can say, resource that we have, over 370 billion tons of coal reserve. And therefore, obviously, 70% of what you produce today in the form of electricity comes from that. And obviously, we have been in the target, and rightly so. And we recognize it long back, and therefore, the shift started in a significant way. Particularly in the last 5-6 years, you have seen solar and wind taking a major share of our new capacity addition that is taking place. This management of change requires several dimensions to be addressed. And one of the weakest thing that we have seen in our governance structure, and that talks very loudly about our public sector management and also private sector management, and of course government, that we have done pretty little insofar as research and technology development is concerned. Very little. Recently, I had the privilege, I was invited to an institution of engineers India. They were doing their 100 years of celebration to put a piece for their centenary publication, and I spent time on this research development and technology development in Indian context. And in that, when I searched for things that we have been talking for last 30, 40, 50 years, we have been talking and talking. Action, talking is, you can give 90 or 100 marks, but action you can give not even 30 marks. That is the point. And it's a self-introspection. I have also been part of that process as an individual. As someone who worked in public sector, who worked in private sector, who worked in government, professional sector, and fairly at good position where one could influence, tried to influence, succeeded in some way, failed in some way, but finally, in terms of action on the technology development, absolutely. And big names in India, I mean, Gopalakrishnan is there. He has been a leader in thought, in creating thoughts in industry. But then all put together, I think we have done very little. And today when we are getting into solar, 70% of what we are doing, we are importing from China. 70%, 80% we are importing from China. And therefore, we started solar. In fact, Tata started solar way back, several decades ago. But then we have done little. And that is a big lesson, that if we have to have, technology is the buzzword, not only digital, all areas of technology is the buzzword. And therefore, technology development and change management, so which goes around technology development, financing of technology development, first, most importantly, recognizing the need for technology development, having a mission mode of going around this, whether it is atomic energy or fossil fuel or non-fossil fuel or solar or wind. I think we have a very massive program, very promising program, very optimistic program, but then we have to support it. We can't go beyond. I think this subject is so huge. We will open up this discussion. The chair wanted that this should be 5 to 6 minutes. I think that is all that I can say, but that is the direction I want to take. And several things that go and several nuances that go along with the management of change, surrounding this renewables, surrounding this COVID, surrounding climate change, disaster, and these are the issues which need to be discussed. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Mr. Shahi. That was very insightful, and you kept to time, so that helps us all. Thank you for that. I'll now request Mr. Bajpai to share his reflections to get us all provoked and thinking even more.
Thank you, Professor. Unfortunately, I'd like to begin from a different standpoint. We are today talking about annihilation of the planet Earth. And therefore, we must do something, at least going forward. If this is not stopped, this is reduced steadily, and we come to a stage when the humanity or the Homo sapiens can continue to live on this planet Earth. As a manager, which I was for 36 long years, I always address the outcomes and the symptoms by first trying to trace what was the disease, if any. Like, for example, once I had blood pressure, and I thought, when I asked the doctor, is that blood pressure is a disease? He said, no, it's a symptom. Now, similarly, annihilation of the planet Earth, whether we use fossil fuel for creating energy, or we use motorbike, which is a kind of a junk, or we use electricity, is an outcome. Now, let me take all of us back to 50 years ago, when the Friedman doctrine overwhelm the corporate world. And there was one and only one owner supposed to be all the corporates, and that was the shareholder. And it was pronounced that the corporates are agents only of the shareholder, and therefore its sole purpose is to create wealth for the shareholders. And that is how the TSR came about. Now, let me park this point here and come back to this point later. And I'm sure I'm going to keep my time of 6 minutes, but I must bring the topic to the forefront if you want to tackle the outcomes or the symptoms. The political theory of the firm dictates that there are various stakeholders whose behavior the firm is able to control. And they are beyond shareholders. They are human resources that work for them. They are customers. They are suppliers of goods and services. There is a state and there is also a society. And the political theory dictates that an egalitarian approach must be used so that no stakeholder is alienated or adversely impacted and is benefited according to the conclusion that the stakeholder makes. And when it does not happen, the power of the state must come to play to correct. And that is where the issue has come to play when the corporates have been told by legislation, but we cannot change the behavior by legislation. And therefore, it was 2017 that all the 184 CEOs were present in the business roundtable in the United States signed up that the stakeholders are including the society. Now the society is asking, please change your behavior. Don't do this annihilation of the planet Earth. And therefore, if you have to create power for the good of the society also, you have to use something which at least reduces and stops slowly. So therefore, the point that I'm going to recommend for consideration for deliberation going forward in the academics is, how do we change first the understanding? And let me mention here, out of those 184 that signed up, and many more signed up later on, only 48 so far have gone back to the board to get their frame changed, that they are not only for shareholders, now they are also to be. Now, similarly, it applies to the society. Society is supposed, Mr. Sai was trying to focus that the government or the state has priority of all the stakeholders. And if there is a hunger, they have to eliminate hunger. If there is a employment, lack of employment, they have to find employment and kind of things. And therefore, the allocation of resources becomes so much. But can they do without keeping in mind that they are going to undermine the planet Earth itself? And therefore, the first and foremost focus of all our discussion has necessarily to be, what is the fundamental disease? And the fundamental disease is, we have been used to not even asking a question, who we are, whom do we serve, and therefore, how we are going to serve. That this service to one stakeholder does not adversely impact the interests of the shareholders. Now, before I conclude my point, let me tell you how in the context of the corporate, they're limited, and so is the case of society. There at least the state, the government, is changed every 5 years if the society feels that they are not doing well, and particularly democratic. And those who are autocratic, well, we don't have to say anything about them. But I'm talking about the corporate. If the shareholders are the only one who is going to decide who is going to be the agents of those stakeholders, then certainly something is going wrong. And therefore, the first understanding, the state means government. Society is the larger part of it. And I distinguish state from the society. Because unless we distinguish state from the society, society gives a form of the governance which becomes a state, which is autocratic, whether democratic, whether whatever else you want to call it. So the point I'm coming back fundamentally is that whether the government, whether the managers of the corporation have to understand who they are. They are an organization, they are an instrument. They are supposed to serve their masters, who are multiple stakeholders. And therefore, they have to decide a methodology by which no stakeholders is adversely impacted. And in the case, who is suffering the most, it is not, in fact, Supreme Court of India passed a very scathing statement the other day in the context of the pollution. I don't know where you are located, Professor Sudarshan. I hope you are not in Delhi, in and around Delhi. So I'm far away in the hills here. So point I'm making is, they said that those guys who are sitting in the five-star hotel are blaming the farmers. The point I'm making is very important to understand that if we want to tackle the outcome of the annihilation of the planet Earth, which includes environment, sustainability, and thereby the method of governance that we use, we have necessarily to go back to the disease. And the disease is that when we feel my owners is only one single shareholder in a corporate, and in the case of the government, if they think only a particular part of the society is my owner, and therefore I serve them and I can get away with that kind of stuff. So I would like the academics to first address this fundamental question that we have got to be able to strengthen this thought very effectively, both in the corporate and in the government mind, that, hey, you have to serve all the stakeholders. B, while serving one set of stakeholders, please do not do away. Supreme Court statement, I was looking at it. Mr. So-and-so sitting in the five-star, don't start telling me that someone else is responsible. He also needs a living, and therefore he has to have an agriculture. And therefore, if there is a stubble, unless you tell him how to deal with the stubble, he's going to do that. But that's not the only cause. You are running your engine, combustion engine, and that is creating much pollution. So having said that, Professor Sudarshan, my recommendation for the academic thing, if we want to make a difference for the thinking of the society at large globally, we will have to go back to address the basic fundamental question, why is this disease? And that's where I'll leave it here.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bajpai. Very wise words. Who are we accountable to? One, many stakeholders, how do we balance? These are all fundamental questions, as you called it, the fundamental disease that we need to cure. I now invite Mr. Gopalakrishnan for his reflections in this first round. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much, Professor Sudarshan. Since it's a Pritam Singh memorial and one had the privilege of knowing Dr. Pritam Singh, may I pay my own personal tribute to him without expanding on why, because he was a wonderful academic who was very impactful on practitioners. The second thing I would like to mention before I make my opening remarks is that I am in the company of very distinguished management and technology professionals like Mr. Shahi and Mr. Bajpai. I'm also in the company of academics, and therefore as I listen to Mr. Shahi talk about technology, fossil fuels, and I listen to Mr. on a wider context, not just governance of companies, but governance of state and administration. As I listen to Mr. Bajpai talk with a little more focus on corporates, I thought I would give you a slightly different melange, but I hope still relevant. You know, this subject is sustainable technology-driven governance. Technology is like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. I'm formerly a technologist, at least I pretend to be a technologist. In the early stages, technology comes as Dr. Jekyll, very nice, benign, promising. In the later stages, it becomes horrendous. It's Mr. Hyde. And humanity is not able to adjust to this. You take some examples. When we wanted more land, we meaning humanity, wanted more land to farm, they invented war. When they wanted mechanical power, they invented steam coal. When they wanted efficient energy, they went to oil and gas. When we wanted peace, we unleashed the atom. And now, when we want speed, we have invented the electron. Each of these came as a Dr. Jekyll for a particular ailment at a point of time and gradually became a Mr. Hyde. So I am seeing this whole point about technology as not a static thing. And I would like to address this subject, not technology driven, but humanity driven. Because technology at the end of the day, as Mr. Bajpai said, cannot be an end in itself. You must go to the root cause, and the root cause is serving humanity. And in this context, I would make 3 points, and I'm going to make them I hope very briefly. The first is I have completed now 35 years as board member in various over 25 companies, public sector, private sector, startups in India, abroad, independent director, non-independent director, CEO. And I reflect back on priorities of a board in a corporation, and they've changed so dramatically. Even 10 years ago, today, if boards have to address what is their priority, there's a decent chance, I've not done a survey, that they will come to three top priorities: people, ESG, and sustainable identity. Don't be changing personality to different people. And this point about ESG is quite important because we think he's the enemy. According to me, there's an enemy behind ESG. When my grandchildren are my age, and that's why we are talking about ESG in the first place, they will worry about electronic waste far more than coal and steam. So we don't see the next big thing that's coming. And we all think IT and artificial intelligence and technology is going to save mankind and improve ESG. It's actually going to make it worse. And the key point, to use Mr. Bajpai's, look at the cause behind and look at the future ahead, is that we must go to the basic human-centric approach to development and management, whether it is the public sector, private sector, or anywhere. And since time is short, and I'm in the company of academics who can do something about it, I have been pleading in several fora, and I chose to speak in this fora not only in honor of Pritam Singh, but also because there are academics like Mr. Sudarshan and maybe others in this session. I'm making a plea that change the orientation of your corporate governance and all your governance teaching, academics. They're all focused on technical things. The law, SEBI. So with due apologies to Mr. Bajpai, he will agree that SEBI is an instrument. Companies Act is another instrument. We are not addressing the behavioral part. And I think Mr. Bajpai himself said, it's not the laws that matter, but the behavior that matters. I don't see a single corporate governance course run by anybody on the behavioral aspect. And like Daniel Kahneman changed the face of economics by saying it's not about mathematics and arithmetic, but it's about behavior. I'm not of that caliber, but I would like to point out that unless behavioral corporate governance enters the vocabulary, and maybe the next Pritam Singh seminar can be on that subject. So what do I mean by behavior? In a nutshell, I'm going to take 4 examples of what I call behavior. First is the use of wisdom rather than anything else. Directors, whether they are in the public sector or the private sector, must learn to be wise. Now, wisdom is like a muscle in the head. You don't become wise with age. Everybody who's got gray hair is not wise. And everybody who's got black hair is not stupid. Wisdom is about using the intellect. Vedanta says wisdom is about using the intellect, not the mind. Daniel Kahneman says it by saying use system 2 thinking, not system 1 thinking. A neuroscientist will say use the right brain rather than the left brain. Choose whichever you want. But there is a definition of wisdom which has got 3 roots: neuroscience, ancient Indian wisdom, and modern economics. Can academics blend these together to help professionals in the private, public sector, in public governance for that matter? Ministers in the Masuri, they should be teaching this, that behavioral governance is probably of the greatest importance for the future. And if I have to describe what I mean by behavioral governance, the outcomes, again to use Mr. Bajpai's expression, there are 3 skills that readily come to my mind. You have to teach people how to listen 3 times more than they speak. Prolixity is one of the diseases that Indians possess because of our great abilities in tark vitark, So none of us suffers from lack of prolixity. But my former chairman used to tell me that your surface area of your ears is 4 times the surface area of your mouth, which is meteorologically, in metric terms, true. But we don't listen 20%, we don't listen 80% and speak 20%, is the other way around. The second skill that requires, they have to be taught, by the way, you have to find behavioral ways of teaching it, is looking at problems with empathy rather than analysis. Too much of our technology training teaches us to be analytical. And that's not a bad thing, it's a terrific thing. But empathy has got lost somewhere. And you can see this in the public space. I won't give examples. And the third and the last thing I want to say, which is the most visible in our public space, everywhere in the world today, is learning how to disagree without becoming disagreeable. It's a skill. And if you look at our Ramayana and Mahabharata, you'll find multiple stories. And if Dr. Mike Ewing will excuse my reminding people, I'm not going to tell the story, when Hanuman was brought to the court of Ravan and everybody wanted his head, it was Vibhishan who spoke up and said, wisdom, corporate governance requires that you don't behead a messenger, you can maim him. And then the rest of the story we all know. So I think my plea today, and apart from honoring Dr. Pritam Singh, is to request all the academics to put their heads together. If I can make a small contribution, I'll be happy to do so, is to bring wisdom back to governance and to look at the various layers of wisdom that we can draw upon. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, sir. Thank you for bringing up some very important insights. In a way, they connect to a message that Dr. Mike Ewing sent to me. You made a reference to the 6 hats of the Bono, some of which, of course, resonate with what you said, because you have to have a hat that enables wisdom and wise decision making, another hat that motivates empathy and concern. And he told us that he's going to wear the black hat and pronounce in a critical fashion what's the current state of affairs with respect to the challenges we face in governance, including corporate governance, and how are we to get out of it. So over to you, Mike.
Thank you. And thank you very much, everybody, for having me. I love coming to India. And one of the attributes of Indians I find is that they're the most optimistic people I've ever met. India is a cauldron of optimism. And I therefore thought, to counter all the optimism, I would take a more pragmatic and I'm afraid to say somewhat negative position, just to provoke debate and explore the pessimistic side of where we stand as a world right now. I don't know about you, but I'm just shocked at the caliber of leadership in the West, in particular, in Western democracies. I don't think we're facing a climate crisis or a governance crisis. I think we're facing a leadership crisis. I just can't see effective leadership anywhere in corporations or in countries. With Angela Merkel's retirement, I really think that was it. That was the one great leader we had in the 21st century. She's gone into a well-deserved retirement. Other than the Scandinavian countries, I don't know where else one can look for leadership. Certainly not to China, and certainly nowhere in the West right now. So, to a large extent, I think the same applies of corporations. In terms of morals and ethics, we've said it all before, and we just say it again. So we had the global financial crisis, which was a crisis of ethics and the lack of ethics. But nothing's changed. We're now on the brink of the Evergrande crisis in China. The chairman of Barclays Bank has just stood down. He could have stood down earlier, but he waited to look at how much evidence was against him in his relationship with Jeffrey Epstein. He sent 1,200 emails to Jeffrey Epstein, and only when he read the evidence did he decide to stand down. The board didn't even fire him. So here's a man heading up one of the most important banks in England who stood down last week, having engaged in 1,200 emails with a convicted pedophile. You know, and that's in 2021. This is 15 years after the GFC and after Enron. So I'm really pessimistic with where we are as a society today in terms of institutional leadership and you know, and moral compass, which just doesn't seem to exist. I was asked to focus on Australia, and I'll do that. If the rest of the world is bad, Australia is worse. There's a lovely quote from 1964, which many of you may have heard. Australia is a lucky country run mainly by second-rate people who share its luck. It lives on other people's ideas. Most of its leaders lack curiosity about the events that surround them, and they are often taken by surprise. That's a quote from 1964. I would argue that we've become a luckier country, and the caliber of leaders has gone from second rate to fifth rate. We have a complete void of leadership in Australia right now. It's popularism, it's polarization, it's petty politics. There is just no evidence of leadership on any level. Corruption is widespread in Australia. A wonderful book has been written, which I urge you to read, called Game of Mates, by a brilliant young economist by the name of Cameron Murray. And the book shows that corruption in Australia is widespread and endemic, but it's quite clever, it's quite nuanced, and it's largely legal. In other words, they're not actually breaking the law. They are sailing close to the wind, but they don't quite break the law. They push the law, they stretch the law, but they don't break the law, but it's still corruption. And it's widespread. Nepotism is widespread in Australia, and bureaucracy and compliance and box ticking. So the most important thing in Australia is not if you do the right thing or the wrong thing, is did you tick the right box? Are you compliant? Did you follow the rules? Did you tick the box? A survey from the Australian Institute of Company Directors shows that directors are losing all confidence in government. And the number one issue that Australian directors are concerned about is excessive focus on compliance over performance. It's not about performance. It's not about how well you do something. It's, did you tick the box? Or can you be prosecuted? Have you covered yourself? So for me, the world is in big trouble. Australia is in even more trouble. The world has bad leaders. Australia has worse leaders. I'm happy to talk about this shortly, but I'm really pessimistic, you know, and let's just look at the superpower on earth, the United States. We've gone from Donald Trump to Joe Biden. That's the caliber of leadership in the most important, successful country on earth. In the democracy, we've gone from Donald Trump to Joe Biden. So let's try and be a little bit, well, before I become slightly more positive, let me be more provocative again. One of the interesting things that I've seen in the last decade is the rise of the billionaire philanthropist, which is interesting, but also troubling. You know, and I raise this because my point is, I don't have faith in government or institutions to be proactive. I'll end up on where I think the proactivity will be, but I don't think it's going to be governments, and I don't think it's going to be corporations that lead proactively. I think they will respond when they have to, but they won't show leadership. So what we are seeing happening is the rise of the billionaire philanthropist, which is good and bad. I think it's a double-edged sword. You know, Ratan Tata, a wonderful human being, Tata Corporation pledging 1,500 crore to fight COVID-19. Fantastic. Is it the role of corporations to fight pandemics? Arguably not. Is it the failure of the Indian health system that required Tata to invest or to donate 1,500 crore? I don't know. Should we be grateful to Tata? Yes, we should. Another example, Johan Eilish, the Swedish billionaire, has just spent $14 million buying 500,000 acres of Amazonian rainforest. All he's going to do with that rainforest is leave it alone. Why did he have to do this? Because Brazil has a crazy president. Bolsonaro is out of control. He's the Trump of the South. So a complete failure of leadership in Brazil, a complete and utter spectacular failure of leadership in Brazil, has required a Swedish billionaire to buy up large sections of the rainforest to protect it, because the country can't do it itself, because of the leadership failure. So, is it a good thing that we're going to become increasingly reliant on these billionaires? There's 700 billionaires in the US. I don't know. I think it's a double-edged sword. I think it's good and bad, but it's sort of filling a gap right now. The last thing I wanted to say, I guess in a more positive sense, to try and be a little bit, to end more positively, is I do predict an increase in citizen activism, citizen boycotts, citizen protests. So people power. I think people power is what will, and also changes in buyer behavior, particularly in rich countries, changes in buyer behavior where customers force corporations to become more environmentally responsible, more green. The combination of citizen activism, citizen boycott, citizen protests, and changes in citizen buyer behavior will force governments to change and force corporations. Governments and corporations won't change because it's the right thing to do. They will change because they have no choice and they still want to make money. So that's kind of where I'm at. I'm at a very cynical point, a very negative view of the world right now. And I think it largely comes down to no leadership, no ethics, and no moral compass. That's the world we found ourselves in as of 2021. And it's going to be, we need the Greta Thunbergs of the world. You can say what you want about her, but without Greta Thunbergs and people power, I don't think, I just don't have any faith in institutions. I have no faith in institutions. So on that negative note, I will say thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for that. It reminds me of a line in Antonio Gramsci's Prison Notebooks. He makes a reference to the pessimism of analysis and then the optimism of will. And your reference to people power as providing some basis for optimism about the future is very well taken. Now, we have to finish around 11. There are only a couple of questions that people have posted on the live part of our discussion. I'll just mention them, and I request all of you to reflect upon the key points that have been made, beginning with Mr. Shahi's immediate concern about how do you both tackle our responsibility for the climate and the planet and the extraordinary extent of energy poverty that millions of people in India are facing. I mean, how do you deal with that challenge? Some reflections about how do you bring wisdom and governance to deal with that kind of a challenge. It certainly calls for a lot of wisdom. The answers are not so ready and obvious. So I'd like you to, in another round, connect to each other's comments, and I hope all of you will touch upon what optimism of will might mean in the context of the very grim and realistic picture that Professor Ewing faced. So the questions from the people listening to us is about, one is about leadership in a sense, it's about democracy. How is it that the more autocratic countries seem to have handled the pandemic better than democratic societies, and what's the role of corporate India in building a welfare-oriented society? Then there's another question about wisdom, and this is something that we will reflect upon, and how policymakers can incorporate wisdom when faced with the with regulations that are needed for technology. And then the question for Professor Ewing is that, in your view, would autocratic, or again the same question, autocratic or democratic leadership? So there seems to be a concern here about some admiration for autocratic societies. I'm reminded that it's all democracies and democratic politics is messy and involves wheeling and dealing and so on. But if we become a little intolerant and cynical about it, we set ourselves up for autocracy and dictatorship. And that at some point the hope is that a democratic polity has more chances of producing leaders who live up to the challenges of the time, whereas the lesson of autocratic politics is that it always results in grief and tragedy for people for a very long time in history. So those are the sort of questions that we have. I'd like you to keep that in the back of your mind, and then reflect upon one another's views before we can end. So I'll again go in the order in which we began, by inviting Mr. Shahi to take a few minutes and to give some final thoughts.
Thank you, Dr. Sudarshan. That is great. I think right in the beginning, we all recognized that the title of our session is so wide, and that is why you have seen the reflection of that very adequately. And I cannot agree more with both our eminent friends, Mr. Bajpai and Gopalakrishnan. And they took the point of something to deal with human values, behavior. I think Mr. Bajpai made very good points on very fundamental as to who we are and how do we deal with situations, and a whole range of basic considerations, even for an organized way of doing anything, managing business or managing the country or managing a village, managing a society. I think they are very, very golden approach, and I think one couldn't agree more on that. And so was the case with Gopal, and I think behavioral. I think I have been one in the MBA program where behavioral science was one of my pet subjects, apart from other technical like finance and marketing. And it goes everywhere. It's like all pervasive, whether you are a technical expert or you are a management expert or you are a human relations or personnel management or a finance. That is something which is so fundamental that most of the leadership lectures that I also, and let me also add to the tribute that that is very, very much due to Dr. Pritam Singh. My association with him was for close to more than 40 years. And then this subject was cutting across all the areas of management programs, particularly at the leadership level. So I think human relations, human behavior, but the only problem is that in management, we always tell that technical skill is easiest to impart. Conceptual skill, it is more difficult to impart. And human behavior skill is most difficult to impart. And therefore, all of us have tried to emulate, try to learn, try to change our way of working, and try to change the way of dealing with our people, our colleagues, peers, and others. And I think both these eminent speakers have said things which are so important. and at the root of everything that we wish to do. Coming to the points made by Mike in the context of whole world and particularly in the context of Australia, I think many of the things, many of the shortcomings, many of the challenges and problems he has identified, and he has narrated very brutally, I can say, the corruption and things like that. I think that is common in many places, including in India. Less developed countries even more. So I think these are important things. So I mean, we ran the risk of this today's session being wide. So that is how it is, and those are the issues which are very much common here. We have our company law, we have our rules of corporate governance, guidelines, we have our guidelines on corporate social responsibility. I think corporate social responsibility, very humbly, I would like to submit to Gopal that those were the issues which were to cover, to address some of those points. I mean, but unfortunately, all these have become more of formats like body and soul. They have become formats, and therefore reporting, how do you report in your board agenda, how do you report in your annual report, how do you, whether it has sort of got deep rooted into the style of working of our managers, into the style of working of the board, into the style of working of every supervisor. One won't say, it depends on project to project, company to company. I think Tata is one of the benchmarks, obviously, all of us should recognize that, but whether that is also perfect or near perfect would be very difficult to say. And therefore, this subject is of that nature, and the climate is a big issue today. That's why it attracted a summit, top-level summit in Glasgow. It has been for the last many years, and that is something again to deal with. Now the issue is, how do we act? I made a point that when I was writing about R&D and technology development efforts in India, really I found that talks have been more. 90% marks I can give. So again, we need not get to become the victim of talks and not to act. So that's the point where this is one issue which has become topmost. Next to maybe terrorism. Next to terrorism, this is another issue which has attracted global attention, and that cuts across. I mean, its impact is not only at the country level, at the leadership level, its impact is the human, all people. Its impact is in villages, its impact is in every country, security, terrorism, security, and climate. And it is there where I think after many years of discussion, there is some ray of hope. In India, there is some ray of hope. We are trying to drive to a point that this issue should in the next 10-15 years should get addressed in an adequate manner. In fact, in some way we are doing a little more than we can cope with, and that is where we are, and we should be. So I think these are my brief comments on the points made by our eminent panelists and some of the questions that have come. I think I have also seen the question of reduced import. We are trying. Technology development is going to happen. You are going to have domestic manufacturing on solar, wind, etc., much more than you have seen in the past. I think awareness is more. You may have seen, many of you may have seen, Reliance has announced hydrogen energy. Adani has announced hydrogen energy. I think Tata has also announced hydrogen energy. NTPC has announced hydrogen energy. So a lot of things are going to happen. Finally, whatever values, human values, etc., they are, as I said, they are fundamental to the working of a society or to a village or to anything. But finally, we have to act. In terms of actions, I am a bit more optimistic than I was, let's say, a few years ago on some of these points which have remained neglected, that it will move on. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Mr. Shahi. You're a true karma yogi. I now request Mr. Bajpai to share his reflections.
Thank you, Professor. Well, let me pick up from where Professor Mike left, and then, of course, follow it up with what Mr. Sai said. Leadership, according to me, is an evolutionary process. leadership evolves. There's nothing called a born leader and kinds of things. It evolves with the kind of challenges the stakeholders or the whom you lead keep throwing at you. And as you know, the best of human being comes out when the challenges are thrown. Now, having said that, let me go back to the theory I had said. It is the counterweight of the stakeholders, which is a reflection of Greta Thunberg's or Z generation's demonstration in Glasgow or United Nations or other forums. Changing customer preferences is another one. Now, therefore, what only I'm trying, and Gopal is absolutely right, that in boardrooms today, ESG has become a matter of discussion. Why? Larry Fink's kind of large investment managers have publicly declared we shall not be supporting those organizations who are not. Now, what I'm only trying to drive myself is to the basic fundamental fact that if governance is a behavior, ultimately what is governance? Optimizing the resources that is placed either before the state or before the corporate. Now, if I have been used to a particular way of behavior because the incentives and motivations, because you can't legislate a behavior, you can't regulate a behavior. Behavior is changed by motivations, and the motivations are determined by the stakeholders. And therefore, when I was sitting at the high priest chair in the securities market, initially, when I was, because I used to sit as a judge also, and I started analyzing the cases, I said, look, leave it here. I want to understand why did he do this? And when I came to realize that this is what he was gaining, and therefore, first and foremost thing I introduced was to disgorgement of his profits. So therefore, if you, but then quick, in democracy, nothing quick happens, no? Because justice is not only to be done, but also to be seen to be done, and that to seen to be done, you know what happens. Now, having come back to the fundamental point I was making is that, and since it's an academic conference, I'm sorry, I'm once again driving you back to the basic fact that what we, and as I said to Gopal, even though very immodestly, that I am, of course, I was professor of Metal 6 for 5 years, visiting professor, but we are academics thinking now. If we want to help the planet Earth, how we are going to. And therefore, we must focus on what will change the behavior of the governments and the corporates. Prime Minister of a country, or the president, elected president, is an agent, is a manager of the interest of those who have elected him. Similarly, a corporate MD, the moment he starts knowing that it is not the only shareholders whom I manage, and that is where we'll have to bring out a lot more of discussions, a lot more of opinion making, that, hey, is this society? See, let me, if you give me 1 minute, I'd like to explain to you where I come fundamentally from.
You have 1 minute, sir.
The 17th century invention of joint stock company with a limited liability and a common seal and a perpetual succession. The basic fundamental society allowed was limited liability. Is there a limited liability of an act? I'm afraid not. Bhopal gas tragedy. Is it limited? No, the corporate paid off whatever they had in their balance sheet and walked away. Society is still. You ask the Madhya Pradesh government or the Union government, they still keep on those generations to have rehabilitated. Now, this unlimited part of the liability of an act of a corporate or act of a government is shouldered by the society. And therefore, the political theory, which is what the academics have invented, I am not the one inventor, I'm only a reader of that theory, which says we must help the corporates now, we must help the government in trying to change their behavior. And that behavior will change only if we are able to change the motivation. See, why did I, every morning before I was allowed to have my brunch in the morning by my mother, she'll say, cleanliness is godliness. See, kind of ingrained in my head, if you are not clean, your food will not go down well. When the moment concept was gone, it is gone away. So therefore, the society will have to bring, and society cannot bring. There are Greta Thunbergs, but that is not enough. And therefore, an intellectual thought of a change of an attitude of a government my answer to your question, change of an attitude to your government, change of an attitude to a corporate manager has necessarily prompted by change in the motivations, change in what we value now. Shall we value irresponsible annihilation of resources and creating of a wealth which maybe legally, as I was trying to focus on, legally right, but certainly not ethically valid. Now, this is where I will leave my point, Professor Sudarshan. If ever you have a need, I'll be happy to share my greater thought, because I have been thinking on this. And as Gopal said, I wrote a book on corporate governance. And that book in 2017 was written, it has become obsolete. My only regret as the chair of the Security Exchange Board of India was that I was able to promulgate all ordinances necessary or regulation necessary for changing the behavior, but I couldn't change the optimization of wealth creation and most efficacious sharing of wealth among all the stakeholders. And that needs much greater public opinion so that the counterweight of the society will start working and give adequate motivation to change behavior.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bajpai. Your words will be music to the ears of Dr. Pritam Singh, who
give me half a minute. He was not only an academic great whom I admire, he was a personal dear friend. And let me tell you, the moment I came to Delhi after handing over charge of SEBI, and first coffee, which was in about 15 days, he came back with the letter of appointment for me as a chair professor of corporate governance of MDI, where he was director. I served as a director on governing board. So not only he was a friend, a very great well-wisher whom everything that we did together, we did several things in LIC together, I cherish. So I would like to use this occasion to pay my homage to him.
Thank you, sir. I recall I was dealing with him when I worked in UNDP in India. We were supporting a relationship with MDI Gurgaon and the Maxwell School at the University of New York, Syracuse. And I remember he said that, education is what remains in our students after they've forgotten all that we have taught them, right? By that he means that, we need to, commit ourselves to producing a certain kind of person as the point of education, not just, things that they will memorize or facts that they will know. So, he was an inspiring figure, and I think we are doing justice to him by these reflections. So I now invite Mr. Gopalakrishnan for his concluding thoughts.
Well, much of what I wish to state has been stated. So without disagreeing with anybody, let me not repeat it in the interest of time. I think what is emerging is as follows, that human beings get attracted to what is visible in front of them and find it very difficult to reflect on the invisible. So they like hardware, but they can't imagine the software. We all want to put on a switch and electricity will come. And then we think of a massive motor generator somewhere generating electricity. But the software that controls the grid is not something that common people will understand until there's a collapse. In the same way, the tools of governance is like the hardware, the behavioral part is like the software. And that's the essence of what I think, I feel, and I suspect my co-panelists don't disagree. I would like Mr. Bajpai to use his influence with the NIA, and I would urge Professor Sudarshan to use his influence with OP Jindal and any other academics who are here to focus on how you can create an academic content. And I think on behalf of Mr. Shahi, Mr. Bajpai and myself, we will commit ourselves to some time to be able to help the process of starting a subject called behavioral corporate governance. And since whenever I stated this, all academics say it's wonderful, and then nothing happens. I'm hoping this time something will happen. You see, if Mike Ewing had said what he said, and his name was Veer Das instead of Mike Ewing, by now he'll be on Australian television 24/7. Mike, you don't know who's Veer Das, but somebody else will tell you later. some guy who went to America in the Kennedy Center and said something, and that's created fire in our television sets. This is there's a unique Indian capability which I want behavioral corporate governance to emanate from India, because we are well suited. First is that in all the Indian religious spiritual teachings, they say, don't accept what I'm saying. Please challenge it, debate it, and come to your own conclusion. Lord Buddha said it. Our Vedanta says it. Sikhism says it. Unlike the canonic religions which say this is handed over by God, so you can't change it. India is known for ideas. China is known for things. Software comes to India naturally of various kinds. Hardware comes to China naturally of various kinds. And I want to close by not describing 3 examples of wisdom, but they are live in front of us, and these can be used to teach. When South Africa came out of apartheid, how did Nelson Mandela teach wisdom? By putting on the Springboks jersey. And it's now so famous that I don't need to repeat the story. That one act of his, unfortunately, it did not influence many of his successors, but that's a separate matter. When India became independent and was unfortunately partitioned, one side said there will be an Islamic state. The other side said then, and continues to say so now, whatever your individual political views may be, that we want to be a state where all people of all religions can live happily. That's wisdom. The easier option was to say we are a Hindu state, be done with it. And there were people who were arguing for that at that time. When Jamshedji Tata was asked in 1890, why do you run this company and what are you going to do for the community? He said, what do you mean doing for the community? It is the community. My company is the community. So he didn't see a distinction between the two. And I think there are many, many such examples we can take, write case studies, teach them, because grandmothers have gone. They are not there in joint families anymore. Nuclear families have dinky parents, double income, no children parents. They are not imparting knowledge. I think this plays up to India's traditional strength. May I just request all these academics to do something about it. And without consulting Shahi and Bajpai, I commit that they will also give some time for this if you come with an idea. Thank you.
Just Gopal, for your
Thank you.
information, I'm guiding a major empirical research in NIA on trying to establish who the stakeholders are and what could be their share, if possible, if you can assess. It is all behavior. It's a very long research which has already, they have come out with one report now, and subsequently things are going to happen, hopefully. So it is not that I'm just only talking. Whatever little I can do for the academics is there. Thank you.
Thank you.
I fully endorse what Gopal said. Let's have an organized study or organized institution for taking care of this aspect. It's important suggestion, right. Very important suggestion.
So Mike, you're going to have the last word. I hope you'll change your hat from black to yellow after hearing our panel.
Thank you, folks. I've just got 3 things to conclude with. The one is just a response to the suggestion around democratic versus autocratic governments. Of course, I'm completely in favor of democracy. Autocracy doesn't work. I mean, it kind of works in Singapore to some extent, but that's fragile. You know, what did Churchill say? Democracy is the worst form of government. The problem is there's no alternative. We still have no alternative. So I absolutely, you know, abide by the democratic tradition as being the only way forward. I'm just, you know, I just wish we could see better caliber leaders in Western style liberal democracies. The second point, I guess, is just in response to Mr. Gopalakrishnan wanting universities to do more and to prepare graduates better. You know, I accept that to some extent, but when it comes to ethics and morality, it's hard for us to take a 19-year-old and create an ethical compass within them if they don't have it already. I think parents and schools, you know, have a responsibility to get the child on the right moral path before they come to university. And then, you know, we can do our best to augment that. But if it's not there, it's, you know, it's hard to create it. And the third point, you're right, I have been negative, and Indians are normally positive, except there's one exception. I was once speaking in Delhi on a panel, and I spoke immediately after the cricketer Ravi Ashwin. And I don't know how many of you know Ravi Ashwin's background, but he's a very clever man, very, very clever man. He did a very good thesis in his bachelor's degree using neural network analysis. He's a very smart guy. And he's also very funny man. He's got a wicked sense of humor. And he was very negative, very, very negative as well. And then I spoke after him. So I'm not the only negative person, Ravi Ashwin can be very negative as well, I can assure you. I want the world to succeed. I crave for a better tomorrow. And I think it comes down to people. People power, to me, is the only way we're going to force democratic governments and public corporations to move in a better direction. Because if we just sit and wait, we're going to be waiting for a while. That's my last thought. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's quite clear that I am now going to try to sum up this rather rich discussion, but on a very wide range of issues. It's very clear that someone said the future is not what it used to be, and so we've got to come up with how to cope with uncertainty, and there is a lot of thinking about it. The discipline of economics, for instance, is going through major changes because it now incorporates uncertainty inspired by quantum physics. So there are advances, there's movement, and the suggestions made for how academia could play a part, particularly in having a meaningful course on behavioral corporate governance, is something that's implementable, doable. We can act upon it, not just talk about it. So I'm very grateful to all of you for your insights and for keeping us all on, absolutely alert. Because every word that you spoke carried a lot of meaning and a lot for us to think and reflect about and act upon.